Welcome, everyone, to the first of our special three-part live stream series, The Long Sili-CON, Power and Censorship in the Digital Era, co-produced by the Real News Network and Project Censored. My name is Maximillian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief here at the Real News, and it's so great to have you all with us. Thank you so much for being here. And please, before we get going, I just wanted to remind everyone who's watching live to engage in the chat and ask questions that you want us to address in this live stream panel discussion. So, from debates about cancel culture and no platforming to the digital disappearing of political dissenters and even entire academic conferences, from big tech companies writing their own laws and controlling how people consume news, to black boxed algorithms that determine how global supply chains operate and how much workers get paid. From viral protests around the world to data breaches and cyber warfare, who or what has power in the digital world? Where does that power come from? And how does it shape our lives? In the 21st century, digital technologies have empowered more people than ever to connect, communicate, commerce, and collectively take political action. However, those same technologies, as well as the entities and systems that control them, have altered the very terrain upon which these activities take place, absorbing them and us into networks of transactions and power relations structured to monetize, exploit, and surveil everything they can. The utopian dream that the digital era would make our lives more free and our societies more democratic has given way to a digital reality in which the meaning of freedom and the possibility of democracy are being drastically redefined. So where do we go from here? And how do we prepare for what lies ahead? So this is what we're going to be digging into over the course of these three live streams with different panels, and we're going to address different key questions in each panel. And we are so excited and so honored to be teaming up with Project Censored to be putting on this series of live streams. So if you like this one, please share it with your friends. It will be posted on YouTube after tonight. And like I said, we will have 2 more live streams coming at the same time, same date, next Wednesday and the Wednesday after that. Like I said, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So today we have a really, really great panel, and we're going to open up this live stream series with a central question that I think we navigate every day, and that is the question of freedom. How free are we in the digital era, right? And I guess I should say that the whole event that brought Project Censored and the Real News together to put on this series of live streams was a virtual academic conference in October of 2020 on critical media literacy that, ironically enough, was completely deleted from YouTube a few weeks after the conference took place. The archives have never been restored, and this is just one instance of many that remind us of the perilous power imbalances caused by the lack of transparency and democratic accountability when it comes to privatized digital services, platforms, and technologies like the ones that we depend on every single day. So we're going to ask here with our panel, in the digital era, when so much of our ability to live, learn, and speak freely is determined by the designs of private companies and black boxed algorithms, what does it mean to be free? And are we free? And do we need to be fighting for a new definition of freedom in the digital era? So, like I said, I could not be more excited about the amazing panel that we have assembled here to help us tackle this question. And I want to introduce you all to them by having them introduce themselves to you. So why don't we go around the panel and everyone give a nice little introduction of yourself and your work. Why don't we go with Andy to start off?
Okay, my name is Andy Lee Roth. I'm a sociologist by training. I come to this panel, I guess, by way of a sociologist's interest in the social forces that shape the production of media and, in particular, news stories. I've been involved with Project Censored since 2006. when I was teaching sociology at Sonoma State University, where my colleague Peter Phillips was at the time the director of Project Censored. And since 2012, I've been the associate director of Project Censored. Project Censored was established at Sonoma State University in 1976 and has since developed a global reputation for its efforts to oppose news censorship in its many guises, and also to champion press freedoms, and particularly to champion the importance of truly independent journalism for democracy. At Project Censored, I do a number of things. I, with Mickey Huff, the project's director, co-edit the project's annual yearbook, the latest edition of which is State of the Free Press 2021, published by Seven Stories Press. I also help to coordinate Project Censored's Campus Affiliates program, which brings together several hundred faculty and students from college and university campuses across North America in a kind of decentralized but networked effort to identify, to vet, and to publicize important but underreported news stories that the public deserves to know more about, but which are not being covered to any extent or at all by the corporate news media. So that's all.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Allison, how about you?
Thanks, Max. Thanks so much. I'm super excited to be here digitally. I'm really not super excited to be here in my dining room. I've been here for a year and a half, right? I teach at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the communication department, where most of my work is focused on critical media literacy and bringing media literacy into K through 12 classrooms, primarily through teacher education and curriculum development. That's a real sort of area of interest of mine, is making sure that teachers are trained in media literacy so that they can really infuse it in their work instead of adding more work to teachers' already incredibly busy days. I'm also on the board of directors for the Media Freedom Foundation and work closely with Andy on the VINS project and with Andy and Mickey in the Media Freedom Foundation work. And I co-direct with a couple other colleagues, Mass Media Literacy, which is a grassroots organization focused on teacher education and curriculum development in critical media literacy.
Oh, yeah. And how about our third panelist?
I'm John K. Wilson. I'm a contributing editor at academblog.org for the American Association of University Professors. I've written 8 books, including Patriotic Correctness, Academic Freedom As Enemies, and Trump Unveiled, Exposing the Bigoted Billionaire. I was a fellow last year with the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. And one of the things I did as part of that fellowship was produce a report about freedom of the press on college campuses, including issues about social media and digital censorship. So I really try to study academic freedom and how colleges have dealt with issues of censorship and digital media, which I think is really important for how we're seeing big tech do much of the same in terms of how they address censorship and these kinds of issues.
Absolutely. And, like John just said, the event that brought us together was academic in nature. And we are going to talk about this disappearance of the Critical Media Literacy Conference, but we're going to use that to kind of zoom out and talk about how the dynamics at play there, what they tell us about the possibility of freedom in the digital era beyond, the realm of higher education, right? As you heard from our amazing panelists with all the amazing work that they are doing, right? There's so many facets to this question, so many areas of our lives that are impacted, right, by the freedoms that we are afforded in the digital era and the freedoms that are taken away by our digital technologies. And so I wanted to, before we dig into this conference, right, and let viewers know what happened, why it's important, and what it says about kind of the nature of freedom in the digital era, I wanted to actually go back around the table now that we've gotten to know a bit about our amazing panelists and ask you to kind of say a little bit more about how the question of freedom figures into your work and just into your daily concerns, right? When you saw the title of this panel, when we all came together, what was the first kind of area of freedom or unfreedom that your mind went to?
Well, thinking about the question of is freedom possible in the digital era from my work, from the standpoint of my work with Project Censored, the first thing I think about are the kind of classic First Amendment freedoms, the freedom to speak, the freedom of the press, and the right to assemble in public. I think it's important to begin to try to unpack those things because they're often treated in conversations, public conversations about media and news. They're often treated either as abstract ideals or as kind of politicized concepts. And so I think it's important to just begin by asking, well, what do we mean by freedom of speech or freedom of the press? And when we talk about free speech, the emphasis is on, the focus is on the rights of an individual to speak. And I think I would say that the work I've done with Project Censored has sensitized me to the importance of considering the flip side of that, if you will, to thinking about the idea of free speech in terms of the rights of the public's right to hear, right? Or if we're talking about freedom of press, the public's right to know. What do people need to hear and know in order to sustain diverse and dynamic publics, and ultimately to sustain democratic self-government? There's been important work. One of the sources that's been very helpful to me on this is faculty member in communications and journalism at the University of Southern California, Mike Anany, and a book of his called Networked Press Freedoms that really focuses on this idea of understanding freedom of speech and freedom of the press in terms of the public's right to hear and to know. As I think about that in terms of the project's work, I think it's manifest in two ways. One would be the project's kind of long-term efforts to be critical of corporate news media when the corporate news media fails to provide the public the kind of information and the kind of perspective, the range of perspective that we need in order to be well-informed community members and engaged citizens. So that would be a critical dimension to this question of these First Amendment freedoms to speech and to freedom of the press. The other aspect of the project's work that comes to mind is how the project attempts to champion and celebrate and hopefully promote to a wider public the good work of numerous independent investigative journalists and numerous independent news outlets that in some ways we're due to this digital era that we're in a kind of golden age of independent journalism in the United States. But that platform is in competition with a much bigger and more prominent corporate platform. And so part of the project's mission is to try to highlight and to build kind of public awareness of, trust in, and support for independent journalism. And one of the ways that the project has done that since its beginnings in 1976 is by publishing an annual listing of the most important but underreported news stories of the previous year. These are news stories that have been that were initially brought forward and reported by independent news outlets and have either received no coverage whatsoever in the corporate news media, or they've received what we think of as partial coverage in both senses of that term, partial meaning both incomplete and possibly also meaning partial in the sense of being biased. So just a couple of examples, and then I'll be eager to hear what other of my fellow panelists have to say. Some of the stories that the project has brought forward among its top 25 for the year 2019-2020 would be the story of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how Native communities are organizing to counter that terrible social crisis. How Monsanto has organized intelligence centers that are intended to target journalists and activists who are engaged in criticism of Monsanto and its products and programs, and how police officers have been implicated in online hate groups from which Facebook has profited. All three of those and nearly 24 more stories are in this year's Project Censored Yearbook, State of the Free Press 2021, and they all represent efforts by independent journalists to basically broaden the public's right to hear and understand important stories, important news reports, and important public issues that have simply been marginalized or excluded altogether by the corporate news media. So I would say, in terms of where I come from through my work at Project Censored, I would say one of the conditions for freedom, however we might define that in the digital era, would be a robust and functioning independent press. And there's strong evidence of that in the project's, on the project website and in the annual yearbook.
Well, I don't think it'll be any shock to anyone here that I, as editor-in-chief here at The Real News, love to hear that. And it's one of the many reasons why we so value the incredible work that Project Censored does and has been doing for a long time. So, Allison, what about you? How does the question of freedom figure into your work and just your kind of daily concerns about the state of this world that we've got here?
Thanks. Yeah, I actually want to start by kind of piggybacking off of some of the stuff that Andy said, especially about that idea of a robust independent press and this notion of, the First Amendment as being this freedom to hear. And in preparation from this, I did pull out my pocket Constitution of the United States and was thinking a lot about the First Amendment. But I think in terms of freedom and coming into my work, it's really through about asking questions about freedom as the freedom to do something, but also the freedom from something, right? The sort of notion of being free from some degree of harm or misinformation. And I think we can come up with far and away too many examples of harm and misinformation in our current environment, as well as certainly our long history of this. I think we often shorthand the First Amendment to that brief phrase of freedom of speech. But I think another way of looking at this is this question of freedom from, or this exploration of freedom from. The specific language is Congress shall make no law. And then it goes into the whole thing about religion. But just to talk in this case specifically about free speech, I'm going to sort of put in an ellipsis here. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, right? This is in many ways, for us as individuals, a protection, right? So that's something that I want to talk about with students a lot. I like to bring up a lot, which is what is this notion of freedom as a form of protection, right? And one of the things that Andy was talking about was what the corporate media leave out, right? I think there's a lot of talk and analysis that needs to be done on the misinformation that we are reading, the real skewing, the bias, etc. But I think a real important conversation is also what's not there, right? What is the corporate media leaving out? What are they ignoring for their own benefit? So I think part of our work in critical media literacy is not only the analysis of what's there, but also the absence of data is data in this case. What's not there? What isn't being discussed? What seems to be left out? And is it really actively being ignored, so that we can look at freedom as both my freedom to do as well as my protection from? And I think that, this past 14 months of COVID has certainly shown that in terms of how polarizing the word freedom has become when it's about mask wearing, right? I am free to not wear a mask because that's my choice. Well, that impinges on other people's freedoms, right? Whereas there might also be a way of saying, I am supporting the freedom of my community by wearing a mask. And so we can just sort of see how these conversations get twisted and turned. And I think our job, my job, the way that I want to address this is to kind of put a pause on those conversations, put a momentary pause and say, what are we doing with this language? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to not do? And what might be a way that we could look at protecting ourselves and being protected by taking apart those words?
Man, makes me wish I could take one of your classes, but I guess we've got a kind of class here. But I mean, it's really, really interesting to think about, right? Because I think one of the most famous alumni of my alma mater, the University of Chicago, an alumnus whom I don't particularly like, but my brother does, Milton Friedman, famously said, "The freedom to swing my fist is limited by the proximity of your face," right? And the reality of COVID. Right. When you mentioned that, Allison, it was like, well, that kind of gives lie to this notion of the individual sphere of freedom when our actions, in fact, do inhibit the freedom of others, like through transmitting a virus because we want to flout kind of any sense of social solidarity by wearing a mask and protecting others from passing on that disease. Anyway, I digress. So, John, what about you? I mean, again, like for all of you, like in a lot of ways, it's very obvious that freedom is a major concern for your work. But I wanted to ask, like as your work has evolved and as you're kind of thinking about things now, where does the question of freedom come in for you?
Well, I think for me, academic freedom is really analogous to the idea of digital freedom because it is the idea that there's a higher aspiration going on, that there's an idea that academic freedom and academic institutions have a greater freedom than you might find in the rest of society. And that was the great hope, I think, of the internet and the digital era, that we would find in these internet institutions a greater standard of freedom than you would find in the regular society. And certainly for academic freedom, I think the idea is that the university is not just another corporation, that students are not customers, that faculty are not just regular employees, that there's something about the enterprise of higher education that requires this greater freedom. It's an essential part of the work that people do within higher education. And I think the same is true of the internet, that it is something inherent in the idea of the digital technology, that we need to aspire to something greater. But of course, while freedom is possible in the digital age, censorship is also possible. And we've seen that a lot at colleges and universities, as well as what big tech is increasingly doing. Just this week, earlier this week, Linfield University in Oregon banned faculty email listservs and then fired a professor for posting criticism online and on social media of the administration. So you have these very real acts of censorship, and I could detail for you case after case after case. What to me is really interesting also is that a lot of the discussion about censorship, whether it's on campus or in digital media, in the mainstream media, it has become centered on the idea that conservatives are the ones being oppressed, being overwhelmingly silenced. And in reality, the opposite is often the case, that you have an enormous amount of censorship of the left and of progressives going on by big tech. And you have on college campuses of the many cases of faculty getting fired for using social media, for tweeting something offensive. Almost all of these cases have been cases of progressive of left-wingers, and almost none of their names are known even within academia, or certainly not to the general public. That we are getting a distorted picture of what kind of censorship is going on. And that, I think, is in many ways distorting the debate that happens about what freedom is possible and what freedom we can aspire to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. And I mean, for anyone who hasn't delved into John's work, I highly, highly recommend that you do. It was actually quite formative for me as a graduate student navigating these same questions, right? When the alt-right was coming to our campus, right? When we were having debates about whose speech was actually being silenced, right? And yeah, I mean, in academia, there's no quicker way to get yourself censored or silenced or fired than to be a vocal, opponent to, I don't know, Israeli apartheid of Palestinians, right? Supporting of the BDS movement, right? That'll get you censored quick, fast, and in a hurry. We know that already, right? And we just published a piece in the Real News this week by Lisa Snowden-McCrae about the account Hood Communist being just wiped off of Twitter with really no notice or explanation and no recourse, right? Really kind of showing, as we all said, that this goes far beyond kind of the case of the disappearing conference that brought us all together. So I want to dig into that in a second. I guess just to kind of follow up on all of your great comments, I wanted to say for my own part, right, where this question of freedom centers, I think obviously as the editor-in-chief here, I think a lot about media. I think about the free press. I think about what it's meant to do and how we as engaged democratic citizens make use of it, right? What it makes us free to do and be, right? And that's I think where, like, I would kind of piggyback on everyone else's great comments to kind of say that in a lot of ways, I am constantly kind of thinking about the question of freedom to be, right? And how our freedom to be ourselves is complicated, especially in the digital era, when we depend on so many technologies that condition us in conscious and unconscious ways to be something else. Right? As Andy mentioned, like, there are algorithms that are pushing us in certain directions while we may feel free, while we may feel like we are expressing our free human agency. We are in fact doing anything but, because we are being shuttled and channeled and canaled into kind of predictable patterns that people can make money off of in a lot of cases. People can surveil, people can predict, right? And so then what does that question of freedom mean when so much of our raw human agency, or what we believe to be our human agency, is kind of eroded, right, by that sort of conditioning, which is always kind of part of life, right? We're always conditioned by our culture, by our place, by the people that we're around. But I think for anyone who even saw that terrible Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, right? I think people realize that we are all, in some sense, being conditioned by the tools that we use. The tools that we use are always in some way using us. And in the digital era, right, that has become more pronounced than ever. And I think it really does complicate the question of freedom. So with that in mind, right, with all these, hopefully this established for people watching, right, that we're not going to come to one final answer to the question of this panel, because there's not one way to approach this question nor one way to interpret it, right? We are all kind of looking at this from different and overlapping angles. But I wanted to, again, bring us back to the event that brought us all together, right? The Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, which was put on in October 2020. It was a digital conference, obviously, because of COVID. And again, by a cruel irony, right? A stunning irony, the conference on critical media literacy was wiped off the face of YouTube and is yet to be restored. So I wanted to actually bring in our Q&A host and my fellow moderator, who's going to be taking over the second part of this panel. Mickey, why don't you also introduce yourself real quick, and then give us a little breakdown of what happened with this conference.
Hi, Max. Thanks so much for all the work that went behind this series. A special thanks to Nolan Higdon, who's working on planning with us. He'll be in one of the later series. And Nolan was one of the key organizers of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas that was last October. And it was actually held through California State University East Bay. That's in the San Francisco Bay Area. By the way, the conference has now been restored. It is now up online, but this is a recent development. It is not at projectcensored.org. It now lives at the Critical Media Project, a site that's hosted at USC from the Annenberg School of Communication. Clinical professor Allison Trope there runs a fabulous program called the Critical Media Project. And under conferences, I've put, if you're on YouTube right now watching us, of course, you'll notice that I have been in the chat room putting various links and things up while our panelists are talking, and I'm linking things that they're saying. So if you want to scroll there, you can see that. So this conference, again, it was a conference about critical media literacy. There were several parts of the conference that talked about algorithmic oppression, gatekeeping. Sophia Noble, author of Algorithms of Oppression, was one of the keynote speakers, ironically talking about online censorship. Deplatforming. Andy Lee Roth at Project Censored, where I'm director, has written about YouTube deplatforming algorithmically of LGBTQI channels and so forth. This has been in a couple of our books. We've written about it, posted on our website, projectcensored.org. So this isn't a new thing, but what we thought was striking, Nolan Higdon contacted me later last year, and we had all been using links to this conference. I mean, it's a didactic thing. We're not talking about a keg party over at Parler. This was a bunch of academics talking about media literacy and censorship and teaching media literacy. It called me out of the blue, and I guess he had heard from another panelist and participant and organizer of the conference, Jeff Scher, a towering figure, by the way, in critical media literacy scholarship, said, "Hey, we're trying to use these videos in class. Where did they go? What happened?" And Nolan called, and I said, "Well, I don't know where they are." Nolan didn't know where they were. They were gone, and Nolan contacted YouTube. Well, that's another story in and of itself. How do you even get a hold of somebody at YouTube, right? But there was no rhyme or reason. There was no explanation, nothing. It just went into the ether as if it never existed. The channel was disappeared entirely. And so we contacted numerous people that were independent journalists that we know, because we know a lot of those folks. And we said, somebody should try to look into this with us, help us out. And Alan MacLeod, who's a media scholar from the UK, writing for Mint Press News, also writes for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Alan wrote a great piece about this conference disappearing. And Alan went poking around, and he couldn't get a straight answer. Basically, they said that the conference was never there. Then they said, wait a minute, we found one of the videos. When they were talking to Alan and Nolan, they had found the keynote, but nothing else. I mean, and there were hours and hours. This was a whole weekend-long academic conference. This thing just disappeared. So some people at YouTube apparently found one conference and put it back up, but the rest of it was gone. Now, fortunately, Nolan had all of the video and was able to eventually get it over to Allison Trope at USC, and it's now on the Critical Media Project website, so you can see it. But we still, to this day, have not received any word, any explanation, nothing, zip, nada, as to what happened to this event, why YouTube canceled it, what algorithm may have triggered it. And then, of course, this has, as you know, Max, this has led to, well, where we are now, right? Is freedom possible in the digital era? We have 2 more of these panel sessions coming up in the next couple of weeks. They're going to look at various facets of this. But tonight, here, we've already heard about the implications for academic freedom. We've heard about censorship in news media and how it's impacted in digital platforms. And also why we need critical media literacy education to be able to sift through mis and disinformation. So we do not need big tech gatekeepers to help us as a nanny figure to tell us what's true and what's false, right? Even fact checkers, which some people may find very helpful. What we need is an educational system that teaches people how to be in the driver's seat of their own mind so they can determine and decide what's happening. We don't need more censors. We don't need algorithms. We don't need blacklisting. We need critical media literacy education. And again, ironically, that's what this conference was about. That disappeared. But if folks want to see it, you can go to the Critical Media Project now and you can see that. And I'll go ahead and put a few more links into the YouTube chat, where I'm also going to be looking for questions and comments, by the way, if people have those for our panelists. So now's a great time for you all. I see that there are 77 people now on YouTube joining us. Welcome, everyone. Feel free to put actual questions, comments, things you would like for our panelists to address, so we can carry that along. But yeah, Max, that's where we are right now, is that we were able to get the event back up. But again, no explanation for why it happened. And Nolan and Allison here, Butler, and a number of great folks are working on the next conference, which will be held next October. So the Project Censored page has an announcement. The CMP page at USC does. And so I'll make sure I put that in there as well. But in a nutshell, that's kind of what happened with this, Max.
Yeah, man. Give a brother some heads up that the conference was restored. No, that's
it hasn't been that long. Yeah.
No, I'm teasing you because, like, yeah, as we were planning this, that was not the case. So I'm so glad to hear that development has happened. And yeah, I mean, like, the bare fact, as we were just saying, right, is that the original conference that was entirely disappeared from YouTube, as far as YouTube is concerned, like, that is gone and it never existed. And for Nolan, for Alan, for anyone who's trying to get it restored, how do you get something restored when you saw it exist, you were part of it, but the entity that was hosting it is telling you they had no record of it? Like, it feels like Kafka's novel The Castle, right? Like, you're just kind of constantly weaving your way through, this sort of like dystopian world, trying to get an answer, when really, like, the kind of joke is that, like, there is no way that you can get that answer because no one believes that you deserve that answer, right? We all just have to adjust ourselves to this terrain that we're on. And so I guess that's what I wanted to ask is, like, what does this tell us about that terrain, right? Going into this panel, I was kind of thinking back to that digital utopian era, right? At the turn of the 21st century, right? When we had this techno-utopian faith that the internet and all the digital technologies that were going to come were going to make us more free. They were going to allow us to connect and share and communicate across the world, right? And in a lot of ways, they did. Right. I mean, we don't want to say that they didn't. We understand that they did. We are living in a fundamentally different world than the one in which I grew up, right? In which all of us grew up, right? So we're not saying that that's not the case, right? But at that time, right, I was going back, trying to put myself back in that frame of mind, trying to remember, the ways that we were imagining what the digital future would look like, right? And there were two kind of examples from pop culture that came to mind. And if y'all will permit me, I promise this has a point. But I was thinking one of probably the most famous pop culture analogy, which is The Matrix, right? That we have this kind of simulacrum of a fake reality that we all believe we're a part of, when the real reality is somewhere beneath it. And then I was thinking about a book that I had to read in elementary school, which was Ender's Game, right? Ender's Game, where you have this kind of character who believes that he is participating in a fiction, in a simulation, a training exercise, a video game, if you will, to find out only at the end that he's actually been killing people, that he's actually been, like, conducting real war in a video game setting, right? And so I bring that up to kind of ask our panel, like, this kind of seems to send a message that the reality that we think we are living in the digital world, the reality that we are invited to believe we're participating in through social media, through YouTube, through all the digital technologies, right? Is it the fiction, right? Or are we just kind of applying kind of a false sense of what this world should be? What actually is this world? So let me condense that and start with Andy. What does this kind of case of the disappearing conference tell you about kind of the laws of the terrain that we're operating on in the digital world?
Yeah, thanks, Max. I mean, I think there's a kind of digital, almost like a kind of form of digital gaslighting here in terms of the experience with YouTube. Gaslighting in the sense that when you finally are able to say, hey, what happened? All these 20 hours of conference video simply disappeared. And YouTube's response is, that never existed. Like, as if you're crazy, as if as if Nolan somehow thought he'd uploaded it all to this channel, but he was actually mistaken, right? We know that's not true because a number of people, as Mickey mentioned, were using various segments of the conference, various videos from the conference as teaching tools. But the YouTube, the official kind of authoritative response was, we have no record of that. If you can prove that you uploaded it, good luck. And you mentioned Kafka and the Castle. My first reaction, because I was also one of those people who went to share a link from the YouTube channel with someone else who was going to use it in their courses. My experience was to think of George Orwell and 1984, where many memorable things from that dystopian novel, but one of them is the idea of the memory holes, where the Ministry of Truth, anything that would be contrary to the interests of the Ministry of Truth, is put in a memory hole, ironically named, which is basically a chute that goes down to a place where those papers, those documents are incinerated and there's no record left of them. But as I thought about it more, even though that metaphor was appealing, some of my training from being a grad student studying the history of news at UCLA came back to me. And I was reminded of a theory of news production and distribution that was kind of very popular in the 1950s, but has since fallen from favor. How this idea of news gatekeeping is newly relevant in the 21st century in this digital era. Very briefly, the idea of news gatekeeping was developed in a couple of canonical studies in the early 1950s by David Manning White and Walter Gieber, who looked at how news editors at local and regional newspapers, how they decided what stories that were coming across the wire service ought to be included in that day's edition of the paper. And they referred to this as gatekeeping because the editor was in a position of allowing some information to pass through to become public knowledge in the form of that day's newspaper edition, and other information to be excluded. That model was predominant in sociology studies of the production of news for probably a couple decades. It still is notable today, I suppose, but it was overshadowed by newer developments, including models of framing and agenda setting. And Michael Schudson, who was a historian of sociology of news, commented on the gatekeeping model that it was in some ways a useful metaphor, but his critique was that it assumed that news was this preformed thing that arrived and the editor either let it through and in the paper or excluded it. And Schudson very correctly said, no, news is a far more complex entity than that. News is constructed. It's not a preformed thing. And that was kind of a nail in the coffin of gatekeeping theory as a predominant sociological explanation for how news is produced and distributed. I started thinking about this after the YouTube censorship of the news conference because it seemed newly relevant. In this case, YouTube and many of the other kind of big tech platforms that we rely on a daily basis now are not journalistic entities. They don't even think of themselves, for instance, in the case of Facebook, as being media platforms, right? Zuckerberg has testified to that effect before Congress, that Facebook is not a media platform. It's something else, right? And there are self-interested reasons for him to claim that. But my point here is that if you think of a kind of new type of gatekeeping, these big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, are making decisions about what kind of news we see and hear, the kinds of things the public has a right to know, even though they don't see themselves as engaged in journalism. And so the old critique of gatekeeping, that it treated news as this pre-constituted thing that wasn't being shaped by the editors themselves, is actually now, that critique is sidelined because the entities that are engaged in gatekeeping in the 21st century, in the digital age, are also not interested in the production of news. They're simply interested in profiting off of news as yet another thing that can be circulated through their social networks. And so I argue in an article that was published by the Marcaz Review in March of 2021 that this new gatekeeping is a grave danger to the integrity of journalism and ultimately to the public's ability to be well informed and therefore engaged in the democratic process.
Yeah, I mean it's wild, and it is a tried and true tactic of the Silicon Valley set, right? I mean, the gig companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Postmates, one of their main arguments for why their workers are not workers is that they say we are not a transportation company, we're a technology company, right? It's like, man, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? I mean, like you can say you don't feel that way. Zuckerberg can say we're not a media company. It's like, well, that's what everyone uses it for. So what does it matter what you call yourself? Allison, what about you? I guess like what is all this kind of starting with the Critical Media Literacy Conference and zooming out? What does this tell you about kind of the rules of the terrain that we're playing on, and maybe even how our understanding of the digital world is very out of sync with the rules that we're playing by?
Well, I mean, I think the rules are ever shifting, right? And so I think in some ways, us as individuals, in some capacity, we kind of can't keep up with the rules in some ways, right? We can't keep up with those shifting rules. And, I really appreciated hearing the sort of Kafka-esque, the George Orwell, the Michael Schudson. I actually took this one a little bit more personally because which is a couple. I mean, I was part of that conference. I wanted to have, and I know that it's up on Allison Trope's site, which is amazing, but I wanted to have access to it. I was like, oh, look, that's never really happened to me before, which got me to sort of thinking about, I think oftentimes there are many of us who are in a kind of complacent, intentionally or otherwise, position where like, this is something that happens to other people. This isn't something that happens to myself. But I think when we pause, we can find examples where it is happening. And that might help us, especially coming at this sort of from a position of teaching and being in a classroom. That moment of pause and self-reflection can help us better understand and help our students better understand the multiple places where this is happening. I think, John, about what you were saying is this notion of the freedom of the internet. And when we look at the internet, it is, such a wild place. Anything can be found, right? Sort of. What does it mean when something can't be found on the internet, right? I mean, what Google search could you possibly do where something isn't there? So to me, there's no way this was an accident. The architecture of the internet means that somebody had to put that information up and then somebody had to take it down. Call it an accident, call it a technical glitch, call it somebody else's error, whatever you want to name it, right? I mean, as you were just saying, the idea that you can call something or say it is or isn't something, sure. Okay, but that's just a surface level, right? You can say that this was never there, except we know that it was there, right? So it's still an action. It's still a choice. And when I said that I sort of took this personally, both in terms of the conference, but as well as my own stuff, my own work that I'm trying to do. I teach a class called Media and Education, where we look at representations of education in media. And I teach the class in the fall semester, and almost always we do a kind of current events moment on representations of education in politics. And, for 3 years, I brought up Betsy DeVos and would bring in pop culture articles of how was Betsy DeVos, the then Secretary of Education, being presented, what was her work being talked about. By the 3rd year that I did this, I could not find anything pro Betsy DeVos, which for me was fine, right? I was personally fine with that, but I wanted to try and find a balance for my class. I wanted to say, this is how she's being analyzed in these media. This is how she's being analyzed in here. It was the easiest thing on the whole planet for me to find criticisms of her. I literally had to type in, Betsy DeVos is the best person on the whole planet before I could find something quote unquote good, right? That was, I guess I messed up my algorithm in that point. Our algorithms often, but are not exclusively correct, right? This one knew how to kind of follow me around and knew what I really wanted, not what I kind of needed at that moment. But in a sort of different example, I got a spam email to my personal account the other day. And for most of those, that's like the easiest part of my day is just deleting those. But this one sort of intrigued me. And I read through the whole thing. And it was somebody writing to me or writing this email saying that they knew what I had done. They would happily keep it a secret if I paid them this amount of money, which was in Bitcoins. And I'm like, well, you're missing the boat on something, because I'm a middle-aged lady. Like, what do I know from Bitcoin? But it did provide a helpful link to how to learn how to use Bitcoin. The reason why I was intrigued by this email and was reading through it was that it was addressed to my dog. And that sent the message to me that there's some intersection of my algorithm. I did pay for everything for him. Like, he never paid for anything on his own. He is also no longer with us. He has since passed away. So I'm getting I mean, maybe he's misbehaving in the afterlife, and that would be amazing. Like, good for him. But somehow the algorithm got screwed up, that somewhere my dog is misbehaving. And I was like, so this algorithm doesn't always work, right? And I think that, sometimes those personal examples can help us see what else is out there, right? I can easily find what I want to find, right? I can continue to believe what I want to believe. But when I get into this some degree of a stumbling block, there's this cognitive disconnect, right? What happens when I can't find, in this case, in the conference's case, what happens when I can't find what was once there? What happens when I can't find what I'm looking for? And what happens when who I am seems to get mixed up a little bit? And I think that that's this sort of place of like, we have to look at it differently. It's not the concrete world. It's not a terrestrial thing. It's this, for me, really hard to wrap my mind around digital place that sometimes has these, going back to Max, to your example of the Matrix, sometimes has these little glitches, right? And maybe that's where, again, like this sort of continuous thing that I keep saying, maybe that's where we take that pause in that glitch and say, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah. The email, the spam email to your dearly departed dog is definitely one of those glitches that's like, like maybe this smooth reality is not as smooth as I thought it was. Well, so I have something to kind of say about that. But John, I wanted to bring you in here and ask, building off everything that we're talking about here from the conference outwards, what does all this tell you about kind of the waters that we're swimming in, and what the rules are and who's making them and how we're playing by them?
Well, I want to emphasize this is not just this one conference. This is happening in lots of different places. Most famously, I think, is San Francisco State University, where the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program organized some events that were actually banned by big tech, by multiple big tech companies. In September, they planned an event with Leila Khaled, who's a Palestinian activist who participated in an airplane hijacking over 50 years ago. And various groups had called for this event to be banned. The university refused to ban it, but Zoom and Facebook actually banned it. And then in the middle of the event, YouTube took down the event. And this created an enormous backlash from advocates of academic freedom who were deeply concerned that now big tech companies were, in essence, banning events that were approved of at universities. And this actually led to some important reforms. So earlier this month, Zoom issued a statement under pressure from all these groups stating that it was supporting academic freedom, was going to let universities have control over these events except where they violated the law. And it seemed like we were about to enter in a new age of freedom from the censorship. And then Zoom immediately censored the next event with Leila Khaled that was at San Francisco State University that happened just a week ago. That was titled, "Whose Narratives? What Free Speech for Palestine?" And the answer is no free speech for Palestine from Facebook or Eventbrite or Zoom, and as well as YouTube. And so you have a real problem now of what is Kafkaesque about this is, of course, there's no explanation about it. And that's one of the things sort of, I think, the history of academic freedom brings us, that one of the ways the AUP and other groups really tried to establish academic freedom was not just to get people to agree to a principle, but to get institutions and universities to agree to procedures and policies so that when there is a punishment of someone or a censorship of someone, that there's due process, that there's an explanation of why this has to happen, that there's an appeal process, and that there are advocacy groups out there who are holding institutions accountable when they fail to meet these standards. And so I think there needs to be that. Now that we're seeing that big tech is committed to censorship, we need to demand of big tech that they actually provide due process, that at least they provide the explanations. The first step, I think, in trying to prevent censorship is forcing the censor to explain themselves, to justify themselves, to publicly explain why they need to repress freedom of speech. Because it's a very difficult thing in many cases to convince people of that a Zoom session needs to be banned because it's going to endanger someone. I think that doing that is important. And I think the other thing we need to do within academia and certainly outside is create alternative institutions, create projects like Project Censored to monitor what big tech is doing, and to create alternative outlets like USC is doing to host what they censor, so that there is still some part of the internet that is free.
I think that's such an important point, and I think it leads us beautifully kind of into the second phase of this live stream, where in a couple minutes here I'm going to pass things over to Mickey to kind of conduct the Q&A portion. And again, to folks watching, if you haven't already, please do drop your questions in the chat, and our brilliant panel will discuss them. But I guess just to kind of synthesize this a bit, right? If anything, the past 50 minutes have shown us, right, that even 3 live streams is not enough to talk about the big questions that we're trying to talk about with this series, right? And we don't want it to, we do not want to give anyone the impression that we're giving the final word on any of this. If anything, we hope that this has unlocked a whole host of questions that we can all go investigate on our own and together, and really kind of, but really start asking better questions, I think, is what we're hoping to kind of get from a lot of this. And again, just a reminder, we do have 2 more live streams coming up next Wednesday and the Wednesday after that, where we're going to carry on this conversation and expand it to other parts of the digital world. But I guess, like, to build on your point, John, about the necessity of alternative institutions, right? I think that one of the point that I was trying to make when I brought up the Ender's Game and the Matrix kind of, competing narratives, right, about like swimming in one reality when the real reality is somewhere else, right, is that, it may be obvious, but I think it's still worth saying that perhaps when we started eking our way into the 21st century, the digital realm felt like a virtual version of the real reality that we lived in every day, right? And this is kind of what Allison was saying. It's hard for us to even wrap our heads around what the digital world is when we're so thoroughly involved in it, right? When it's such a part of our lives. It's not kind of the it's not what it was, right? It isn't this kind of thing that you can go on for maybe a few minutes, or a thing that maybe a few people have. It is a necessity. It is a part of our daily lives, right? I mean, the services that we use, the communications that we have, the commerce that is made possible through digital technologies, right? These are not privileges. These are not augments or kind of secondary pieces of reality. These are intertwined with whatever our non-digital reality actually is. So then the question really becomes like, okay, well, if that is the case, if the kind of digital world of which we're a part is a fundamental aspect of our being, right, and of the functioning of our society, then it starts to become all the more perilous and terrifying to realize that that world is governed entirely, almost entirely, by the designs of businesses, of these sorts of algorithms, right, that are, calibrated to serve certain ends, and they are not necessarily the ends that we think they are, right? The businesses that we depend on that run so much of the digital world, they're not there to just offer stuff for free, right? They're trying to get something from us, right? They're trying to get something from the service that they're providing. And so really, this is a long-winded way of saying that, like you were saying, Allison, there is no real kind of disconnect between the matrix and the real reality, right? We're in some sort of knot here, and we depend on so much of this digital world that is almost entirely run by kind of the interests of private entities. You know, people, especially on the right, have said for years that they want government to be run like a business. This is what it looks like, right? This is what government run like a business is. It's no accountability, right? It's everything guided towards the ends of making profit, right? And having lack of accountability, lack of transparency, no one to kind of go to with grievances and stuff like that. And the last thing I wanted to say and really emphasize is that this isn't just what government run like a business would look like. This is government run like a business, right? One of the points that I'm always kind of hammering home is that the market, what we call the market, is a form of government, even if we don't call it that, right? And that's kind of true out of everything that we've been saying here, right? The ways that we act, the ways that we can communicate, they're governed by these private entities that can take our ability to exist in the digital world away at the drop of a hat. So Andy, I saw you had a kind of follow-up to that before we toss things over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to just retrieve something you said, but preface it by saying, you know, both Alice and I began by talking about the First Amendment and First Amendment freedoms of speech and assembly and press. But of course, the First Amendment says Congress can't stifle those things. Congress shouldn't stifle those things. The First Amendment, as Allison said, is a protection for us as members of this societal community, but it says nothing about corporations. So in line with what you're saying, Max. But then I wanted to retrieve something that you said a moment ago and just add a layer to it, if I may. You talked about how at the beginning of the 21st century, you know, the digital world seemed like it was in some sense connected to the real world, maybe more than it perhaps is or seems now. But I think when we're talking about algorithms, one of the most important points to be reminded of over and over and over again is that, you know, if algorithms are built upon existing human prejudices, even if the algorithm itself is ostensibly, objectively viewpoint neutral, the algorithm will simply add new layers to deeply sedimented pre-existing social inequalities. And this is not just me asserting this. This is the point that is made by numerous studies. Sophia Noble, who Mickey mentioned earlier, was one of the keynote speakers at this conference we've been talking about. Sophia Noble, the author of Algorithms of Oppression, Virginia Eubanks on automating inequality, Kathy O'Neill on weapons of math destruction. These are all about how algorithms in multiple dimensions of human life, not just, you know, what gets filtered or censored online, how algorithms basically bake in pre-existing prejudices and then reproduce them as if they are the results of these content neutral, decisions that have nothing to do with any human agency. And that's, I think, one of the most deeply misunderstood things about algorithms. And when we talk about critical media literacy, I think a fundamental component of that in the digital era has got to be algorithmic literacy. This is as simple as saying, you know, it's important to understand that the search engines we use are not neutral information sources. The social media feeds through which many of us receive news and information about the world are not neutral information sources, right? I'm saying, I think, something that you, just in slightly different words, something that you were saying a moment ago, Max, right? The algorithms that drive these things, our search engines, our social media feeds, serve to reproduce, in many ways, existing inequalities. But they do it in subtle ways that we're not privy to, because these algorithms are considered by the companies that have developed them and that implement them to be proprietary intellectual property, which means I mentioned this idea of, sociological studies of gatekeeping a while ago, right? Back in the 1950s, David Manning White or Walter Gieber could go and study in a newsroom how an editor makes a decision about which stories to include in the paper and which stories to exclude. There can be no contemporary David Manning White or Walter Gieber today, because Google and Facebook and all these other big tech platforms consider those algorithms to be proprietary, and they have no interest in having any public access to those algorithms. They aren't even interested in having non-public third-party access to how those algorithms work, despite the fact that we have all kinds of circumstantial evidence that these algorithms are deeply biased in so many ways.
Yeah, man. I mean, it was kind of like what Allison was saying, right? When you're trying to teach a class and looking for examples of Betsy DeVos, the algorithm learns what your preferences are. It adjusts the search results to those preferences and starts funneling you the results that it thinks you want. So for viewers, you take that basic principle and you apply it to a society that has a lot of, problems with racist shit, with like classist stuff, right? That has a lot of deep existing kind of inequalities that are going to kind of be reproduced to kind of reflect that the society that exists. Then we've got a really big problem on our hands. And so I think what I'm hearing from Mickey and from the live chat is that people want to know about where we go from here. So Mickey, I'm going to toss things over to you, my man, so you can take us home with the Q&A section and let us know what the folks in the chat have been talking about.
Thanks so much, Max. This has been a stellar conversation. Things are lively in the chat right now. We've got about 81 people on right now. The number's been climbing. Welcome, everybody. I'm Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored. One of the folks behind the scenes here that's helped plan this with Nolan Higdon and Max and Kayla and Dwayne and the great people at the Real News Network. Project Censored is honored to partner with the great folks at the Real News Network. And we're looking forward to more of your questions and comments right now in the YouTube chat that I am monitoring. And also, we've got 2 more coming up next week. Next Wednesday, we're going to have another stellar panel. Week after that, we're going to have yet another. It's going to include Abby Martin, Nolan Higdon, and others. Of course, Max will be our wonderful host through all of this, guiding us through. And I will be here to field the YouTube questions. And, hopefully the jokes about the beard will lessen as the weeks go on. But nevertheless, we've heard a lot of great things right now that I think are very, very significant. And one of the few things that's coming through the thread is, great. What do we do? When are we going to get the solutions, right? And of course, one of the things we always do at Project Censored is we don't wait to the last minute, per se, to get to the conclusions. We wanted to vote, at least a chunk of our time, right? We've got another 23 minutes here technically left with our 3 panelists, and we want to feed in some more of the questions and things that you have. And we also want to get to, what do we do about this? So I want to start with John Wilson, because, if you don't know the work of Academe Blog and the work of the American Association of University Professors and people that fight staunchly for academic freedom, please familiarize yourself with them, because it's extremely important. And it overlaps so extraordinarily with the free press, free speech, free expression clauses protected in the First Amendment. And I wanted to say again what I wrote in the chat, that so many of these corporations that we say have a right to exist in the marketplace aren't subject to the First Amendment. But let's go back a second. And then, John, I want to flip it over to you and then go to Allison and Andy. We, taxpayers, we're citizens. We're not consumers. We're not shoppers of democracy and candidates. We are citizens of a society that have rights. And among those rights include the right to access information. You look at Article 19 under the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It talks about the right to be heard as well as to express oneself. Well, that's all modeled off of what we saw in the Constitution. So these big tech companies are by proxy operating with government support. There's no Google without DARPA and the Pentagon. None of it. There's no Google, there's no social media, there's no Facebook without the federal government and people working inside of government with taxpayer-funded money. This is a purposeful ruse that's been set up like an offshore tax haven, if you will, for the metaphor, that allows companies to say, well, what are we going to do? And how are we going to, we can't really go and do that. Or the government will say, well, we're not censoring. I guess they're deciding who they want to do business with. Well, look, I think that academia, in the best ideal sense, And when we talk about the importance of public education, John Wilson, why academic freedom is so important is because it's buttressed on the idea that free expression, free flow of information is a necessity for a robust, healthy, self-governing society. So if you could pick up on that large riff, could you talk a little bit again? How do you see the solutions of what you're doing at Academe Blog and the work you do promoting academic freedom as a bigger part of the solution societally as it bleeds into a lot of these other areas? John Wilson.
Well, I often come with this with some skepticism about trying to find easy solutions. I think there are solutions, but they're not easy. I'm someone I'm skeptical of the algorithms, but I'm also a little skeptical of human agency, and I'm very skeptical of government agencies. And so I don't see, when you look, for example, at the problems Project Censored identifies with the mainstream media, the solution to that is not to hand over the keys to Donald Trump or Joe Biden and let them decide what fake news is and control the media. The solution is in alternative media. It's in building public media, alternative kinds of forms of media, competing media, criticism of media, all of these kinds of institutions that I think can create that kind of critical force. And likewise with the internet, with big tech, a lot of this is about trying to allow for alternative institutions to be created, not necessarily the government trying to control and micromanage what these tech companies are going to do, because it would often be a worse decision than they're already doing. But instead to try and figure out how can we create these alternatives within academia. If Zoom is censoring, the university's events, universities should band together and create their own video conferencing technology, just as universities have run their own internet service providers and email for years. There isn't a technological barrier to the universities and other institutions creating alternatives to what is currently being done by the corporate media, the corporate tech, all of these other corporate institutions. We need to create these alternatives.
So Allison Butler, I want to bring it over to you. Mass Media Lit, Action Coalition for Media Education, smartmediaeducation.net. By the way, Academe Blog. Is it .org, John? So before we're done here, please shamelessly promote ways that people can get in touch with you and follow your work. I've had everyone here has been on the Project Censored radio show, projectcensored.org. John Wilson was on twice this year talking about his very significant book on Rush Limbaugh, talking about fairness doctrine and so forth. So a lot of information here and a lot of stuff has been going in the chat. But Allison Butler, what are some strategies? We have one of the questions here, some strategies for getting students to engage with the content neutrality principles underlying the First Amendment. What are some things that you propose? You are an expert in training teachers in media literacy, critical media literacy education. So again, back to sort of where I started with John, but let's let you have a go at this and tell people what are some ways that you can help people be in the driver's seat to determine the veracity of information.
I mean, thanks, Mickey. I think one thing we all need to think about right away when we're talking about this stuff is our digital footprint is immeasurable, right? We cannot measure our digital footprint. And I think that's something that is really important to recognize. It's not just the websites I go to regularly or my email that I check all the time or some quick thing I'm looking up. Our digital footprint is giant, right? And it's giant from a really young age these days. So I think we need to do a lot of, in terms of your question of strategies, is do a lot of self-reflection. The corporate media constructs a space where we are, quote unquote, best served, take that loosely, of course, where we are best served as docile beings, right? It's absolutely an exercise of freedom to question the content, to question the production, to question what we see, to question what's behind the scenes. So I would say in terms of, a number one strategy is to really start by asking the questions and maybe at least for the short term, be less concerned with the answers, right? It's about kind of acknowledging that there's a lot more out there that we don't know And how do we begin to really exercise that questioning muscle? I work with students and teachers, but certainly students on a regular basis in the classroom who, when they kind of start to figure out what's going on, they get really angry with themselves. How come I didn't know this before? Sometimes they'll get angry with the institution of education, that sort of broad space of education, and say, how come nobody ever taught me this before? And I kind of take a couple steps back and say, that's cool. How about we learn it now, right? Like, that anger is really sort of self-directed as like, whoa, I've been missing something. No, that's not your fault. That's how the corporate media are designed. They're designed for us to miss a lot of information, right? Certainly one of the easiest metaphors to apply here is the Wizard of Oz, right? The old man behind the curtain, right? In front of the curtain is Oz, this master, but behind the curtain is just a little old dude. What do we do to get behind the curtain, right? And so it's about asking those questions. It's about sharing with our students what's out there for them to learn more, so that it's not about us dictating, right? That would be another, if asking questions is sort of strategy number one, strategy number two is no dictating, no telling. It's too easy, absolutely. But also we need to kind of be able to figure all of this stuff out. We need to be able to embody these lessons so that we can make an informed choice, right? Again, going back, Max, to talking about the Matrix, I can't remember the character's name, but he willfully admits, I want to live in ignorance. Okay, that's a choice, right? And so by, starting by asking questions and then providing our students, providing our communities, providing our colleagues, and certainly in my work with teacher education, providing pre-service teachers the opportunity, the tools, the resources, et cetera, to start to embody their own learning and their own knowledge of it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Allison Butler. And again, ACME, the Action Coalition for Media Education, smartmediaeducation.net, also vice president with us at the Media Freedom Foundation, working with us at Project Censored on so many things. Andy Lee Roth, I want to bring you into this because, one of the other questions here that comes is, how do we get behind that curtain? What is behind that curtain? What kind of questions do we ask? Andy, you are also, among the many hats you wear with us at Project Censored, co-editor with me of Project Censored State of the Free Press 2021, forward by Matt Taibbi. You run the Validated Independent News program and the Campus Affiliates program at Project Censored, which is an academic outreach program that we run for free. We have about 20 campuses actively involved, hundreds of students a year. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about that, looking behind the curtain and the kind of questions, that we ask and that we teach people to ask, and the kind of things that go into what makes a validated independent news story that encourages people to turn off corporate media, not to ignore it, but not to rely on it for a totality of our information, and why these independent voices are so important, and how we are also teaching students to be independent critical thinkers. Andy Lee Roth.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about the Campus Affiliates program, Project Censored's Campus Affiliates program. And then I also want to add in just a couple of small but practical things that we can do in terms of kind of resisting the overwhelming power of algorithms in our daily lives. On the Campus Affiliates program, as I mentioned at the outset of the program tonight, several hundred college and university students and professors across North America participate every year in this program. From the students' point of view, they're working on a story that they come to think of as their own story, an independent news story on a topic that they've chosen, and they're researching that story to try to determine whether it's received any quality corporate news coverage or not. They are ultimately writing up a summary of the story, its key points. So they're developing some journalistic skills in terms of writing a summary lead and a factually based account of what the news story that they've been researching consists of. They're also assessing, as I say, the corporate news coverage, if there is any of that story, the competing corporate news coverage. And they're ultimately, if they meet the criteria that the project has established and that are available on the Project Censored website, those stories get posted online on the Project Censored website as validated independent news stories. And from there, they become part of this year-long annual research process by which we identify and ultimately rank, order, and determine the year's 25 most important but underreported stories. So students who participate in the validated independent news exercise get a chance to do, they're not studying about critical media literacy, they're doing it. And that, I think, is an important shift, right? They're actively involved in the process themselves. And one of the things that students find very motivating in the doing of that exercise is that suddenly they're working on something that has potentially an audience beyond the four walls of their classroom, that might be read by many people beyond their peers in the course and the professor who is their instructor for that course. And that, in my experience, when I've been doing years I've done this assignment with students of my own, is highly motivating for many students, that students are hungry to have a voice of their own, not just on, say, an Instagram or a TikTok account, but on something they perceive as being independently legitimated, the way, hopefully for many of them, the Project Censored website is, or the annual yearbook is. So I can't. I could go on and on, for a three-part series about the value and the virtues of the campus affiliates program, and if there are any faculty or students involved in this broadcast tonight, and you're interested, you can find ways to reach us through the Project Censored website, and you can learn more about the program there. Just quickly on algorithmic kind of defense mechanisms. I mentioned earlier the idea that it's important, I think, just fundamentally to remember that search engines and social media feeds are not neutral conduits of information, but just that's a beginning foundational understanding, I think. I would say one of the things that we can do in terms of algorithms, this is very simple, but I think it links to something more profound. We should stop using the word Google as a verb to describe a generic online activity, right? Why should we associate the practice of searching for information with the brand name of a corporation that has done as much as any entity out there to multiply what Shoshana Zuboff, the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, calls epistemic inequality? Right? Epistemic inequality is Zuboff's term for the difference between what we can know when we go online and what can be known about us by others, especially these big tech corporations, when we're active online. And so avoid using Google as a verb is one small way of resisting the kind of hegemonic power of that epistemic inequality. Another thing I would say that's, I think, very simple, and it won't solve the problem ultimately, but it's a stopgap measure that undermines some of the pervasive power of algorithms to shape the kind of news and information that we're privy to, is to connect directly to the news organizations that are displaying firm commitments to ethical journalism. Connect directly with them rather than relying on social media feeds or other indirect ways of getting information about them. So go to these trustworthy news organizations' websites, sign up for their email lists or their RSS feeds, a very early 21st century concept. Subscribe to the print versions of those outlets, products or information if there is a print version. By going direct that way, what you're doing is you're cutting out the social media platform or the search engine as basically an unnecessary and potentially biased intermediary. And I think, again, that's not going to change the world, but if more of us did that, and we had, until we get more of the alternative infrastructure that John's been talking about, that I think is crucial to advocate for, until we get it, there are ways to, in effect, work around the existing pathways so that we're less dependent on the algorithms of a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter. The final thing is, I think, to call out algorithmic bias when you encounter it. You call it out directly to the people or organizations that are responsible for it, and you call it out publicly so that others are aware of it. And in effect, this piece I ended up writing for the Marcaz Review was me doing just that, right? I had this experience like Allison described a little bit ago of, wow, of course, I've been studying online filtering and content exclusion as long as I've been involved in Project Censored. But I'd never experienced it directly myself in terms of work I'd done, work of my own, right? My participation in this conference that we've been talking about. And so to call it out, that's part of what motivated me to write that piece. And I think that's an important thing to do too. Ultimately, I believe, I mentioned these are kind of stopgap measures. Ultimately, there are several lawsuits, class action lawsuits against YouTube that aim to force YouTube, if not necessarily to expose its algorithms publicly, but at least to make those algorithms available to independent third-party review. And if those lawsuits are successful, that would give us, that would open up that black box that Max was talking about at the beginning of this program tonight, and would allow us to see, okay, how is it that we consistently get, Google News promoting transphobic and homophobic views on its news aggregator, right? Is that the result of biases that have been built into the algorithm itself? Is that simply the result of successful gaming of how the algorithm works by conservatives with anti-LGBTQ agendas or not? But until that time comes, until that lawsuit or one of those lawsuits is judged in favor of the plaintiffs, we won't know what's in those algorithms. We'll only know what their effects are. And we have to then figure out ways to work around the kind of epistemic inequality that is a condition of how these algorithms operate.
Thanks so much, Andy Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored. You can get in touch at andy@projectcensored.org, www.projectcensored.org. It's as you can see in California, it is sundown time and the sun is creeping into the space here. So maybe that's a good time to start to turn things over to Max to have our concluding remarks. We're almost out of time. I just wanted to very quickly do a couple shameless plugs here. This is the newest Project Censored book, Censored State of the Free Press 2021, that talks about a lot of the things that Andy Lee Roth was just saying. Also, of course, not on this panel, but on a future panel, one of our organizers here behind the scenes, Nolan Higdon, has a fantastic book called The Anatomy of Fake News. And there's a great chapter in it on the fake news detection kit that I think is extremely important. Also, the work we did in United States of Distraction and our documentary film of the same name. Very quickly, if we could go back to you, Allison Butler, and then quickly to John Wilson before we go to Max. Really quickly, give a couple of websites, any kind of contact info, quick final remarks so we can hand things back over to Max. Allison.
Okay. Quick final remarks. Okay. As really quickly as I can say it, I think one thing that we all need to be thinking about is that personal space versus the digital space, and sort of who we are and what questions we want to ask, and to kind of keep asking those questions, and keep doing, like as Andy said, when can we do media literacy versus learning about it? And so when we start asking questions and kind of keep asking the questions, that's a starting point, right? In terms of sort of shameless plugs, Mickey, thank you so much, as you've mentioned it. If there are any teachers on this live stream, one of my books is called Educating Media Literacy, the need for teacher education in media literacy. And it's about making sure that, the space of teacher education deserves to have a sort of focus with media literacy. As I've also mentioned, I co-run with Nolan Higdon as well the Mass Media Literacy, which is focused on really truly tailor-made curriculum and teacher education models for bringing critical media literacy across subject matters in K through 12. I'm super proud of the work that I get to do with the Media Freedom Foundation, particularly as Andy talked about the VINS project, having our students write that. So any, higher ed folks on here, I really strongly recommend that. It is game changing for the students. Also involved with ACME, the Action Coalition for Media Education, which is focused on critical media literacy scholarship. So lots of work in higher education on ways to bring critical media literacy into our research and our scholarship.
Thanks, Allison. Now, John Wilson, Academe Blog.
Yes, I encourage people to read academblog.org, as well as to get involved in Project Censored and all these other efforts and to create your own efforts. I think freedom is something that is possible in the digital age, but it's not going to be handed to us by giant corporations. It's something we're going to have to work for and fight for.
John, thanks so much. Allison, Andy, very grateful for this didactic conversation. And we bring it back to our fabulous host, Max. I hand it over to you. Thank you again.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mickey. Thank you to our brilliant panelists, Allison, John, Andy, and thank you to everyone who worked on planning this, including Mickey and Nolan and everyone at Project Censored, including our brilliant studio manager, Dwayne, who's been running this live stream, Kayla Rivera, who's been helping us with all the planning, and of course, as we mentioned, Nolan behind the scenes. Definitely glad we gave him a shout out, and you will see Nolan on future live streams as well. And so before I kind of round out with a final remark, I did want to emphasize for viewers, again, this is a 3-part live stream series, and it is our hope that it really kind of sparks more conversations than it ends, right? And if you want conversations like this, go check out Project Censored, their podcast, check out The Real News and a lot of the content that we're producing, because we're going to keep this conversation going, especially through this live stream, but not exclusively, right? And so for those who are asking about solutions, that is actually going to be a big focus of the next panel when we start talking about the question of democracy and whether or not democracy can exist in the digital era. So we're going to take a lot of what we learned from this live stream and kind of expand it out to that broader question. And I think that, just to kind of underscore the why we're so excited that this live stream came together and why we're so proud to be teaming up with Project Censored, right? You heard all of our panelists mention the importance of building alternative institutions, including and especially alternative media institutions. That is a fundamental necessity, right, for us to kind of build up this infrastructure so that we are not entirely beholden to the whims of these large private corporations. The next step from there is to do what we're doing here, is to bring those independent outlets together and collaborate, right? To not exist in our own little silos, right? But to build shared communities of truth and concern and debate and information sharing, right? That can provide the type of learning and conversation that we've had in this live stream, right? And so we are so honored to be partnering with Project Censored for this, and this is one of many great collaborations that The Real News is a part of. So I really wanted to underscore that. The final, I guess, thought for me leading into the next panel by way of this brilliant panel that we've had here is that, I think we can't be naive about this, right? I mean, as important as alternative institutions are, right? Both on the digital terrain and beyond it, right? I mentioned earlier this important piece that our managing editor, Lisa Snowden-McCrae, did, where she interviewed one of the members of the Hood Communist Collective about their accounts on Twitter just being kind of wiped off. So this member of the Hood Communist Collective said that, like, what this shows is that our political organizing, whether it be at Hood Communist or anywhere else, it cannot exist solely online, because if it does, then this is enough to kill a political movement, right? So we cannot make ourselves that vulnerable, right, to these kind of arbitrary and black boxed whims of the overlords of the digital realm, right? We have to build robust digital and non-digital networks of community and of organizing and of connection and information sharing, so that we can at least withstand, right, whatever kind of censorship we may face, while, you know, like everything that we talked about in this panel continues to unfold in the 21st century. But when I say we can't be naive, what I mean is that we also can't abandon this terrain, right? The answer is not to just go completely offline, go completely off the grid, and therein lies some sort of, you know, perfect freedom. That's not the case in the 21st century, right? Because so much of what it means to be free, right, is intertwined with this digital world. It's inseparable from that digital world. And we have to, as John beautifully said, we have to fight for it. We cannot abdicate this terrain. We cannot exodus from this terrain and leave it to be dominated by the forces that currently dominate it. So we have to protect ourselves in the non-digital realm and build up our capacities there. But we also have to recognize that the meaning of freedom in the digital era is up to us. It is up to the fight that we wage. And it is a cause, you know, I think worth fighting for. And so that's, I guess, like, you know, me trying to kind of take a lot of the big thoughts that our brilliant panel shared. And again, please tune in next week for the second of these live streams. Thank you so much to our amazing panel. Thank you to Mickey for co-hosting this with me and fielding those questions. Brilliant discussion, everyone. Can't thank y'all enough. And everyone, please have a good night. And yeah, I guess if you want to watch the State of Address, go for it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Honor to be here.